Hi, Sophie-Grace.
Hi, Agnes.
So I wanted to start off by asking a question about Plato's Phaedo. So, you've described to me being transgender as something like, having a sense that you're like who you should be physically is not aligned with sort of obvious facts about your body.
Mhm.
And there's a passage in the Phaedo where Socrates describes philosophers as people for whom embodiment is like first and foremost a problem. That is, the people for whom it is a problem, like people who are in some sense at war with the very fact of having a body.
Yeah.
I got it out here, so I wanted to read just one line from it. He says, um, we should be closest to knowledge if we refrain as much as possible from association with the body and do not join with it more than we must. I don't know. I guess I just wanted to hear your reflections on that. And there's a strand of philosophical thinking that is like, um, that is like there's a kind of discomfort with the very fact of having a body. So I just want to hear what you thought about that.
Well, yeah, I notice there's a strain in Plato, and I'm I'm absolutely in love with Plato and always have been. Plato's one of my great heroes. Um, and one of the well, what should I call them? Trans-exclusionary, gender-critical people that we seem to be so good at breeding and nurturing in the UK was saying on Twitter just the other day that transgenderism, as she calls it, she thinks it's an ism, is a death cult because it's all about the platonic separation of the body from the spirit, and that she thought was evil and absolutely characteristic of us transgender people. And I'm usually with Plato, there's something I can see in what he's saying that I agree with, and usually I'm on the bus with him in some way. But this anti-body business, which actually, let's face it, is pretty fundamental in Plato. To me, it's not just it doesn't just seem wrong. It's like I can't even see why anyone would go there. I can't see why. Well, I guess I can, but it's just not a natural position for me at all. And so when this GC person was saying on Twitter, transgender people are people who hate the physical. They're all about the disembodied. They're all about the soul against the body. I thought, really, are we? That's not me at all. That's not where I'm coming from in the slightest. Um, so, I mean, we go back to my own metaphysics here, which is much more neo-aristotelian animalist than disembodied souls, which happen somehow to have lodged in a body like a hermit crab in a cowrie shell. That's not how I see it at all. I don't think we're like that in the slightest. I don't actually think. I mean, I'm a Christian, but I don't, in that sense, believe in the soul at all. I don't think there is a separation that you can make between the hermit crab and the cowrie shell, between the body and the soul, as if there's something inside us which is the soul, which is separable from the body. I don't see it that way at all. I am a living animal. I'm an animal who's alive, and the life that is in me is the life of that animal. It's not the life of something else separate from that. So and animalism, I'm not sure what's become of it in contemporary philosophy. Never quite sure where the philosophy of personal identity and the metaphysics of the body is going. But animalism is the view that I think is right about the relation of the person to the body, and the relation is pretty much identity. Um, you have to put some caveats around that because the body, like other physical objects, is in constant flux. So, I mean, a table, for example, is it identical with its particles or is it constituted by them? That's a question that metaphysicians spend a lot of time on. I'm not quite sure how I answer that question, but what's certainly true is that if you go down enough levels, then you find there's this enormous flux of particles in and out of any material body. So you do need to have a metaphysics of organisms, I think, to understand what we are. We're not just physical objects, we are organisms, and organisms are very special physical objects because they can sustain identity over all sorts of changes in their materials, the things that make them up, and still be the same animal, as we all familiarly do. But animals is what we are. I'm a human animal. And So this side of Plato I find very antipathetic. That's not how I think of it at all. Um, and I don't think the body is a bad thing. And I don't hate my body. I'm not against my body. I'm very happy to be this body and this person. It seems in many ways just right. And there's a lot I do with my body that I love doing with it. I'm quite a physical person. When I transitioned, a lot of people said, "But you, a transgender person, but you're so macho." A lot of them said to me, by which they meant that you do lots of cycling, and you do lots of mountaineering, and you ski, and you used to play rugby and all that kind of stuff. How can you possibly be a transgender person? Because transgender people are supposed to be, well, I'm not sure what they're supposed to be, but not like that anyway. But no, I'm very happy with the physical. I'm not against the physical. I don't share Plato's revulsion for the physical. I think one thing that's going on here, if we have to explain why Plato thought that way, is, of course, that in his day, perhaps it was more difficult to be a physical being. Perhaps there was more disgust. Perhaps there was more having your nose rubbed in the earthiness of life, and the, all the grotty and smelly and putrid sides of being a human. Perhaps were more evident. Perhaps that's where it comes from. But no, sorry, that's a long answer. But I'm not at all bothered about being physical. I like it.
I want to defend Plato a little bit, but I'm surprised by this. I didn't see this thing on this tweet that you mentioned. I'm surprised because my thought was precisely the opposite, that someone who's transgender, insofar as there is this sense that you have of, like, this is the body I should have, that would be an intention with Plato. So I expected some kind of answer like that. But just to where is Plato coming from? So I think the Phaedo is the most extreme text on this point. So I picked, he's not always the spad, so to speak, but I picked that because I find it challenging too. But so I think where Plato is coming from is that the body seems to give you answers to a bunch of questions that actually you need to think about.
Yeah.
There's this automatic, he says it impedes our search for truth, right? And there's this automatic and reflexive sense that I know what I should do, that my body tells me what I should do, and that has to, in some sense, be resisted in order to make space for philosophy. And that, like there are facts about me and there are facts about my body, and you might say that they have to be, I have to sort of take them into account and live with them. But I also thought that maybe being transgender, you would there would be a tendency to appreciate this point that the too quick of an answer, the body giving too quick of an answer, is kind of a problem, and there's something insightful about that thought.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, there is something seductive about the body. And I mean, the Symposium is the greatest text for this, I think, for the attractions of the body and why they are seductions and why we have to resist them. So I use the word seduction seductive deliberately, because I think sex and death are very much in the picture here. Sex and death are just about the two most obvious facts about bodily life, I guess. And I think there is a very definite rhythm I think this is gendered. I think there is a rhythm in male sexuality which isn't there in female sexuality, which is about, lust, release, disgust, you might say. I think that pattern is very common in male sexuality. So, the famous story about, was it Flaubert or was it Proust? It was one or the other. I think it was Proust. So he's writing his novel, and he suddenly gets overcome by a fit of randomness, and he does the business with one of his chambermaids up against the wall. And then as soon as he's finished, he shouts in her face, "You have cost me a chapter." and that's the kind of rhythm I mean. I think men are like that, and I think it's very male to prone to see, as Plato does, to see the body as a distraction, to see sexuality as a distraction, embodiment as a distraction. I think that's a very male impulse, and in some ways, as I think the Flaubert or Proust anecdote indicates, it's a rather shallow kind of reaction. You would have thought that even a thoroughly masculine gendered man would be a bit more reflective about sexuality than that. And Plato seems simply to dismiss sexuality. I mean, maybe it's wrong to say just for that kind of reason, but that kind of lust, release, disgust rhythm, I think it's discernibly there in quite a lot that Plato writes. And one of the other greatest thinkers about the human condition ever, Shakespeare, I mean, the sonnets are a master study, both in what it's like to be, well, to use a Platonic word, enchained to that ravening beast of sexuality. But at the same time, Shakespeare sees deeper into the matter. He sees that there's the expense of spirit and a waste of shame. But he also sees is lust in action. But he also sees that besides that account of sexuality is, which for a man at one level is quite true, there's also more to be said. And he goes deeper into the matter, I think, than Plato. And then death, I think, well, actually, two things. Death, sex, death, deception. So the second thing is death. And death links with sex on the one hand, because, of course, sex is reproduction and death is the extinction of any particular individual. Death is worrying because we have this urge to find, I don't know, the infinite truth, the great truths of the world, the forms, whatever. We're all yearning towards that. We're all yearning to some kind of immortal truth. And the hope that we might find that kind of immortality without, in some sense, distancing ourselves from our animal nature. I think we do have to say that. So bookmark that. We'll come back to it. In what sense should you distance yourself from your animal nature? There is some sense. I think it has to do with the fact that the ideals that you can set up for yourself in a mortal life tend to be illusory, in the sense that you're going to die, and however much you achieve, it's all going to pass. And then, of course, just the fact that our senses are so deceptive, I think that turns Plato off the physical world too. And of course, coming back to lust, release, disgust, that's what sexuality does too. Sexuality makes you see, at 5 to 3, to Flaubert, the chambermaid is absolutely irresistible. At 5 past 3, she's just a bloody nuisance, and why is she even in his office? And sorry, this is perhaps a rather horribly rapey example, but whilst it is rather rapey, it also has its comical side, and I think there's also something rather deep about it.
Let's take a pause and say hello to everybody. Hi, welcome to Night Owls. I'm Agnes Callard. I am a professor here in the philosophy department at the University of Chicago, and I run Night Owls. And Sophie-Grace, do you want to introduce yourself?
I am the professor of philosophy at the Open University in the UK, which is a kind of unique institution. It was founded in the 60s by the most progressive government that Britain's ever had. Britain's Roosevelt was Harold Wilson, and he introduced all sorts of social reforms. And one of the things that he did, which was brilliant, I think, was he said, education is transformative. University education changes people's lives. We aren't getting enough people into Britain because we're stuck in this stupid class system. We only have a handful of universities where only the posh go. So we're going to open it up. And the Wilson government founded lots and lots of new universities at the beginning of the 60s. But that wasn't enough for them, because they also said, well, there are people who still won't go to university. How are we going to get to them? And the answer was the Open University, which was founded in 1967 as a university where you could get a degree by a mixture of correspondence course, very wooden and clunky television programs, which are well worth tracking down on YouTube just to see the 70s and 60s awful fashions, if you can. And later on, of course, we became an internet university. And so the Open University has a kind of unique place in British life. I don't think there's a parallel in the USA, but I'm enormously proud of them and very glad to work for the Open University. And I write on Plato, and I write on ethics, and sometimes I write on gender, but not always.
Great. Tyler, do you want to come up and say hello?
Hi, I'm Tyler Zimmer. I also, like Agnes, teach in the philosophy department, and I will be helping to coordinate the question and answer session later in this event. So I'd like to encourage you to use the ask a question function at the bottom of the screen to ask questions, because later on we'll choose from among those and put them to our speakers.
Great. So the way it's going to work is that Sophie-Grace and I will talk for like maybe another 40 minutes or so. And then that's going to be your chance to come and ask questions. And so, yeah, you can put your question in now. If there's a bunch of questions already, you know, read through them and maybe upvote. If your question's already been asked, you can upvote it. And okay, so I have this question that it might take me several tries to get it out. So
all good philosophy happens under conditions of leisure. Never in a hurry when we're doing philosophy.
Yeah, it's a good point.
Plato says it and Wittgenstein says it too, so it must be true if they both.
That's if they agree. I feel like, you know, I read a bunch of sort of interviews with you and stuff that you've written, and like one strand of thought that you articulate is like, you know, trans people want to sort of live their lives without being like sort of ridiculed and discriminated against and hassled, and in a way it would just be great if like it's like if we were sort of done with this, in the sense that being trans would be like having blue eyes or something, and that we could just like get over it. And that's one strand. But another strand is like the final line in this paper that you just delivered, where you were like, hey, this is an exciting time to be around, because there's going to be this conceptual engineering happening of our new concepts, and we have a chance to learn something. And that I'm especially excited by that second, but I'm kind of interested just to hear you talk more about these two strands of thought, and then I kind of have a bunch of questions about the second one.
Right. So I think a lot of the time, if I have a difficulty about giving talks about gender, it is that I just kind of feel, well, you know, why do we even need to talk about this? Why is this such a big deal? And I'm constantly making analogies with both race and sexuality. Being transgender isn't like racial identity, and it's not like sexual identity either. But in a good society, nobody cares whether you're black or white. It's not an issue, and nobody cares whether you're gay or straight or bi or asexual or whatever. It's just not an issue. Why would it even come up? And in a certain way, I hope this doesn't sound to other transgender people like a betrayal, but in a certain sense, I'm not really that interested in being transgender. I have other agendas. I have other stuff to do. And coming out as a trans woman is kind of getting that sorted, getting it off the agenda. Because when you're in the closet, when you're hiding the fact that you're transgender, it's enormously distracting and disruptive. I mean, to put it flippantly, it's a bloody nuisance. But of course, it's much worse than that. Because I think the deepest question that you face when you're transgender and nobody knows, or hardly anyone knows, the deepest question you face is, what would people think of me if they really knew what I'm like? And that is an awful burden. And you feel like you're deceiving people by not being open about who you are. And you feel like you don't know what they really think of you because they don't know this key thing about you. And so coming out gets you past that. And it's a huge relief. And then you do hope that you will be treated as I was treated when I was recently a visiting professor in New Zealand. It's just a complete non-issue. And people really weren't bothered by it. I mean, they noticed it for sure, because I don't usually pass. So people knew I was transgender, but no one was bothered about it or excited about it. So that's one side. And connected with that, I was saying in our conversation a minute ago that I like having my body. Well, I do. I mean, except apart from the business of gender, I do like being bodily. I'm quite happy with that. I'm also not really, and I hope this isn't too obvious in the way I'm dressed, I'm not really a fashionista. I'm not hugely bothered about fashion. I just want a look that works for me and that I can live with. And that's all I want, because I mean, basically, I'm character type. The character type I am is a batty professor. That's what I really am. And batty professors are notoriously absent-minded about their dress, and that's much more me than being someone who spends half an hour every day in front of the mirror. So that's another way in which, for me, it's just not the focus of my attention. I just am transgender, and so what? That's certainly one side of it. So that brings us on to the business of conceptual engineering and the way our concepts change, and the question of which of them change and how they change. So with gay people, our concept of what a gay person is has reorganized itself massively. I'm speaking about Britain here, but I think there are analogues about the US. It's reorganized itself massively since, say, the 1950s, in a good way, because the concept was that homosexual people fitted a stereotype of being, well, I don't want to go on about it too much because it's a nasty stereotype, but they were shady characters who hung out in public loos and engaged in nefarious activities in the bushes on Hampstead Heath and all this kind of stuff. They were automatically associated with creeping and perving and being around the edges of society and not being central to it. And they were associated to particularly vicious and nasty association with paedophilia. And so in all those ways, our concept of what gay people are, specifically gay men, I mean, gay women, lesbians was another kind of stereotype, but not a nicer one particularly. So we had this stereotype, and we had our society's thinking and our society's law organized around that thick concept of what it is to be homosexual. And it's a massive improvement for gay people that we don't see them that way anymore. And the way people see it now, I think, if I understand correctly what's going around me, roughly speaking, people think, well, there are some people who are wired way A, the heterosexual way, and there are some people who are wired way B, the homosexual way. And there are other possibilities, of course, as well. There's also being bi, there's also being asexual, and so on. But the two first cases people become aware of are heterosexual and homosexual, and the spirit is very much they're just different ways a person can be wired. And so what I'd like people to think about transgender people, I suppose, the way in which our thick concept of what it is to be a trans woman or a trans man needs to change, I think is something like this. People need to think of it more as a question of wiring in that sense. There's just different ways you can be wired. That's another one. People need to be clearer that being transgender is nothing to do with your sexuality. Those are just different dials. They're completely different dials. And you can be this way or that way on the sexuality dial, and this way or that way on the gender dial, and it's just different. And in the case of gender, it seems like there are three basic possibilities. Either people are just agendered in the way that people can be asexual, so they're not either gender. That's their sense of themselves. They don't think of themselves as male. They don't identify with being male or as female. And that's actually a way of conceiving yourself that I have some sympathy with, in as much as I'm someone to whom, all this stuff is just something to get past, and then we can get on with our lives. But there's being gender non-affirming in that sense, being a they, and then there's being someone who is happy with their body as it is, and the way they would like to be lines up with the way their body actually is. And then there are people for whom that's not the case, and they're the trans ones. We're the ones who see ourselves, feel ourselves, conceive ourselves as being the other way from what our birth physiology gave us. And that is how it is for some people. And the question is then what you're going to do about it. And I think one of the reasons why transgender people have not been more visible in other centuries, they have been visible sometimes, especially in non-Western societies. But the reason why they haven't been more visible is because the answers that have been given to that question have been quite diverse, but few of them have been the answer that what you should do about it if you're transgender is that you should try to live in the other gender. And that's what we now think the correct answer is. And I think from my own experience, it's a pretty good answer. But I think a lot of the time in the past, other answers were given. And that way, people who were actually transgender were disguised. They were hidden from view. So those are the kinds of changes in our thick concepts that I'm talking about when I talk about conceptual engineering.
Can I just ask a follow about that tripartite classification? I guess I'm not sure I understand how to model the agender person along the same lines as you just described the transgender.
Yeah.
And could you just say more about that? You see the question, because it's like, how do they stand in relation to their body, I guess, would be the...
Yes, right. So I don't want to say too much here, because this isn't who I am, and I should let them speak for themselves. In talking about a tripartition, as I just have, I wanted to recognize their existence. I wanted to get them on the map. It's important that that should happen. It's also important that I should not presume to speak for them when that's not my experience. That's not who I am. But as far as I understand it, I'll just chance my arm by saying this. I think there are actually a number of different kinds of people in the agendered category. I think there are people for whom they don't care which gender they are. I think there are people for whom they don't like being one gender, but they don't want to be the other either. I think there are people who just wish the whole business of having a gendered body would go away. I think there are people who just don't want there to be gender, quite generally, and not necessarily just for themselves. So I think, this is something I'd say about transgender too, and indeed about cisgender. I think there's a grave danger in thinking that all transgender people are alike. I think there can be all sorts of ways of being transgender. And so one thing we might come on to talk about in a minute is theories of gender and how people account for the fact that they're transgender. And I don't want to be too dismissive or mocking about how other people do this. In the way I account for my being transgender is, I would say, I was assigned male at birth. Physiologically, I was born with a male body. It turns out that I am happier living a female life, and I have a deep desire to be female. I'm also aware that that isn't the way that I was born. People often think that we're deluded. We're not deluded at all. We're not deceiving ourselves about anything. We know perfectly well what shape we are. The point is that you have to learn how to live with a fundamental longing to be the other shape. So that's one way of being transgender. Other people, I'll start by saying something unkind and mocking. Some people seem to think that they are transgender because they're Cleopatra reincarnated or something. So, here I am, I say, I explain the fact that I am transgender by saying, well, in a previous life I was Cleopatra. And this is unkind mockery, because as a philosopher, I want to respond to that by saying, well, that doesn't explain anything, because Cleopatra, what about her? Who was she reincarnated? And if she was someone else reincarnated, then maybe she was Ramesses reincarnated. So why didn't she want to be Ramesses, and why don't you want to be Ramesses?
This is Plato's theory, by the way. He thinks they're reincarnated. That's in the Phaedo,
well,
right?
indeed, yes,
as
yes.
animals.
So I'm mocking Plato, and I hope I'm not mocking anyone today who thinks in something like that way. But people do have different views about gender, and I used to be more dismissive. I used to say, no, this is what gender is. This is what being transgender is, because this is how I understand it. So clearly this must be right, because it's my understanding. And all these people who say they feel feminine, or they have a pink brain but a blue body, or things like that. And again, I'm being a bit snarky here. But people who say that kind of thing, I used to be inclined to say, well, they must be talking rubbish, because that's not how I experience being transgender. And then I copped onto myself. I realized what I was doing. And I said, well, actually, we can be disjunctive here. Maybe there are different reasons why people end up affirming the basic sentence, which is for transgender people. I still think the basic sentence is, my body is this way, but I want it to be that way. But there might be lots of reasons why people end up affirming that sentence. It doesn't have to be, as it is with me, just a brute way things are. And I don't have an explanation of it. I don't know why I'm like that. I just am. I don't know why I'm an extrovert, but I just am.
Me too. So there's a kind of approach to gender that I don't think I've seen articulated, and so I don't know that I'll succeed in doing so myself, but it's something that I'm sort of attracted to, is like that for me it feels like being a woman is like a target that I aim at. That is, and so I want to think like a woman. I hope to do so. I try to do so. It's not that well, there's some way of doing so that I'm fated to or something, or it's like, no, in fact I may not succeed. So I may not get there. But that I was reading, for the first time a few weeks ago, Mill's Subjection of Women. And something that's really striking about that text is that he's sort of saying, we don't know what women are like yet. Because all our data comes from conditions of oppression. And so we're like, we think we know what they're good at, but we haven't give them a chance. And so I kind of feel like, well, still, I mean, that wasn't, whatever, 160 years ago or something. It's not that long ago. And so I guess one thing that excites me about the idea of the conceptual engineering, certainly there is the element of it, right, where we have to pull something away from the association with deviancy or something like that, right? As you're saying, both with gay and with trans, there's that tendency of like, this is deviant. It's a way of shutting it out. But I also feel like there's this opportunity, like there's a very negative version of gender essentialism where anything like, to say that there's a woman way of doing something is has to be limiting, as opposed to, for me, it's like, no, I want to figure out what that is.
Right.
I think there could be something good there. And maybe not just one thing, right? But I guess I wonder, like, whether, I mean, it's not something that I necessarily think every woman's going to be interested in, is finding this like feminine mode of thinking. But I feel like I would like there somehow to be space in thinking about gender where that's like one thing we could be doing, is sort of like looking for it.
What would it be like? I want to ask you, when you say that, what would it be like to succeed in, you talk about hitting the target of being a woman. What would it be like if you succeeded in doing that? Because I kind of find I don't know what people mean when they say that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I mean. So I think that maybe what it is there are like aspects of my life that have gone under theorized and that I have not incorporated into my intellectual life. I felt like at the end of my book, I start talking about infertility and miscarriage, and like feeling like that's an important part of the theory of aspiration. It's like, for me, aspiring to be a parent and these various like blocks, and so being able to think philosophically about something like aspiration, but integrate these sorts of experiences. But also for me, a lot of times thinking about my own emotions and my own emotional responses and the ways in which my thinking about them is itself emotionally infused. Like, so I feel like I have something of a sense of it when I'm doing it. Those are some examples. But I don't know. I mean, sometimes it's thinking about clothing too, and fashion, and like why it is important to me, and why is it important to me, which I don't fully understand why it's important to me. But for me, it's actually part of extroversion. It's like, I like making a spectacle of myself in a certain way, and I kind of can't tell which part of that is female, and that I want to know which part of it is. Some of it seems to be. So I guess these sorts of questions for me like show up in my philosophical life.
Yeah. I suppose I can think of two other questions, one of which would take it down, and one of which would take it up in level of intelligibility and in level of how central it would be to our lives. So I'm just comparing the question, what would it be like to live, to reach the target of living the ideal of being a woman? I'm just comparing that question with two other possible questions. So one would be, what would it be like to hit the target of being a left-handed person? Now, that's one way of taking the question, what would it be like to hit the target of living as a woman? Comparing it with the target of living as a left-handed person, well, is there anything that left-handed people do distinctively? Well, I guess use scissors. More left-handed people are ambidextrous because they're left-handed, and they had to work out how to do it with the right hand as well. Maybe left-handed people are distinctive in the way they play cricket. Oh, good, I get to mention cricket. I always love doing this with American audiences. I throw cricket language at them and it confuses the hell out of them. Sorry, mustn't go there. So anyway, yes, I mean, if you're a left-handed tennis player or baseball player or whatever, perhaps you do things distinctively. But really, it's not very central to your life whether you're left-handed or right-handed. It's just kind of incidental. So being male or female might be like that. But alternatively, if you say, what would it be like to hit the target of living the life as a parent? Well, being a parent, as we both know, is a lifelong commitment. It's completely consuming, and it's a never-ending need to be responsive to someone else and to listen to someone else, whether you want to or not. You've got to do that, and if you don't, you're failing. You're failing as a person if you don't listen to your children, if you don't care about your children. And well, I try, but I routinely think I've fallen down in small ways and think I wasn't really paying attention to that conversation. I should have been. My bad. I need to try harder. So okay, that's a very long way of putting into context, perhaps, the question, what would it be to hit the target of living as a woman? And I suppose I have, over time, thought of it more like the question, what is it like to be to live the target of the left-handed life, and less like what is it like to live the life of the parent. So I kind of downgraded the importance of being a woman, and I've become more a person who says, let's just get past all that and get on with living. No matter, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter whether you're left-handed or right-handed. It doesn't matter whether you're a man or woman. Just get on with living. And I'm sure that I'm doing that. I'm sure I'm not completely right to do that. And I'm sure that I'm doing that because it's a kind of, victor's privilege. When you get something sorted out, you no longer have to worry about it. And so one of the most famous and saddest stories about the way marriages can go wrong is that someone is absolutely desperate to court someone. And then once they've successfully courted them and they end up married, and they just start neglecting them. They just toss them aside, like the famous, two cases of this. The famous scene at the end of the Blues Brothers, where
I've seen it, but it's
Carrie.
been so long ago that I don't remember.
Sorry, yes, it's showing my age. Carrie Fisher is about to murder Jake at a crucial moment in the movie, and Jake actually takes his sunglasses off, and Carrie Fisher, who used to be his lover, and he tossed her aside. She completely melts when he takes his glasses off. She falls into, oh, Jake. He gives a long, lingering kiss and then throws her in the mud and says, okay, let's go. And they're back on mission. So victor's privilege is when you achieve something and you kind of get past it. You don't need to worry about it anymore. And so you don't care about it as much. Another, a much sadder and less funny example of this is J.R.R. Tolkien, who there was all this Beren and Luthien stuff when they were courting, and they had a very difficult courtship because their parents were opposed. And then Tolkien, Ronald married Edith, and they lived for however many years afterwards, a happy marriage for 50 years. But Tolkien was an awfully neglectful husband, it seems to me. Edith had a quite separate life from him, and Ronald was not particularly interested in his wife once he'd won her. So where am I coming out with this rather long train of thought? Just at the point that maybe I should revisit this question of how important it is to try and live as a distinctively feminine life, because maybe I am suffering a bit from victor's privilege with this question, having felt for so long that it was a crucial thing ahead of me, and been really, really into pink brain, blue brain stuff, and then getting past it because, I feel like I've solved this problem in my life, and so perhaps I'm not thinking about it as hard as I should.
How would you compare it to being Scottish? That is, you talk in this piece about sort of adopting Scotland as your homeland. And do you also feel about being Scottish that it's like, it's this thing, I've achieved it, I'm done, I don't need to focus on the fact that I'm Scottish? Or is it more like the parenting case?
That's really interesting because actually, because I'm politically active in Scotland, I'm a sort of cyber nat, as they say. I'm online arguing the case for independence quite a lot. So actually, I'm enormously switched on to that question. And do I think it matters? I think it matters hugely, because so if you ask me the question, what would it be like to live and successfully hit the target of living a distinctively Scottish life, then I do have an answer to that, and it's a really important answer, I think, politically, and it's nothing to do with cabers and haggises and claymores and kilts. It's not about that. It's about being a new, imaginative Nordic social democracy in our own way. I mean, we'll still be part of Britain in at least a geographical sense, so we won't be a Nordic democracy in the way that the Nordic countries are. We won't be Denmark. We won't be Norway. We'll do it differently. But is it important for us politically to work out what we want to be and who we want to be, and where exactly all the cabers and claymores and haggis stuff fits into who we are? Yes, that's a hugely important conversation. So it's interesting. I went for the downplaying comparison with left-handedness, and I went for the upplaying comparison with parenthood. I didn't spot the comparison with Scottishness until you pointed it out. But yes, that's really interesting, because politically it is, I think, the question: what do we want to be when we get our independence? What do we want to be? I think that's a huge question and absolutely central. So why isn't there a parallel question about being a woman? I'm not sure.
Right. Well, maybe, one can only push forward on so many of these fronts at one time. So that could be part of the answer.
I guess it's also because I think that gender relations, they actually fit into the politics, as far as I'm concerned. That's part of what we need to work out to be a good society. And I mean, it comes down, actually, it's a sort of meta question hanging over all these questions. I'm like Plato in that I think politics is really the meta science, and it's above all the others. And theory is above even that. But anyway, so the question of how the genders relate to each other is a political question too, and it fits in with that political question that I've been talking about in the case of Scotland. What kind of good society do we want to have? Crucial to that is, how do we want men and women, and cis men, cis trans women, cis women, trans men? How do we want them to fit in? That's all part of the political question.
So on the political question, it seems to me that, like, there's you were articulating this kind of like almost like utopian vision of like where being trans could just like not be a big deal, and it seems like we're living at a time which is the opposite of that, where in some way people are gravitating towards the issues that make it a big deal, like as though they want to fight about it. It's almost, I almost feel like, for many people, it's like, it's a relief that there's a thing about bathrooms, and then there's a thing about hormones, and because then we can fight about this issue. So I wonder, it's almost like, I don't know, in a marriage or something, you can have these things where like you're fighting about the laundry, but it's not really about the laundry, but there will be something, there will be some spark or something. So why has this become, and it seems to me like kind of recently, like after you transitioned, right, has become something that we want to fight about? Why?
Do you think this is happening in the US too, or do you mean the UK particularly?
I mean, I hear a lot of it happening in the UK, sort of through you on Twitter, but I feel like it's happening within the discipline of philosophy. Like,
Yeah.
I get, yes, it's definitely happening in the US too.
I think it's a way of playing out the argument about gender that our society needs to have. And the basic question in that argument is, I think, is a sort of combination of the question you asked and the question I've been asking. So the question is, how do we want masculinity and femininity to look in our society? What have we got room for? What are we not going to include? And there's this whole business of role playing too. So I've written about roles sometimes as a way of trying to understand the transgender issue. And the question about roles is, what would the gender roles be in our society? In what ways would you take hold of the realities of your life, from the biological realities through the psychological to the socially conditioned realities? In what ways would you take hold of that and play that role and deliberately seek to occupy that role, and in what, as it is, and in what ways would you try and transform that role, and in what ways would you say, well, actually, we don't want this kind of role in society at all? So there are all sorts of different answers available to those questions. Feminism as a movement has had a very salutary effect, sometimes a very stringent and caustic effect on society, in forcing it to think about these questions. And I think for a lot of people who come across as trans exclusionary or gender critical, there's a mashup of various things going on. One is that they're asking that question and they're trying to push it. And some of them simply haven't come across the phenomenon of transgender very much before. And they are quite wedded to a biological way of thinking about things. And they do think the biological is the only category that matters. Of course, it's a category that matters. And so they think that anyone who claims to be transgender must be, in some sense, deluding themselves, or in some sense, living a lie about who they are. Whereas, of course, transgender people say it the other way around. We say we're living a lie. I say I'm living a lie if I try and live a masculine life. So they basically react to trans women by saying, well, they're men, and they're men in our space, and we women are a political community, and we're trying to reconfigure what it is to be feminine. And to do that, we need to be free from male influences. We need to get a space where we can do this sort of thing without them butting in. And trans women are just another way for men to butt in. I think that's how they see it. And some of these people are, I think some of the gender criticals are, they genuinely hate men. They really do. And hatred of the other gender happens, and it's not incomprehensible when it does happen. Often it happens on the basis of trauma. So I'm thinking that quite often for people who are extreme in that kind of way, it's because they themselves have had an awful experience of the other gender and of the other sex. So I think that's all going on. I think there's also a sense that trans people are part of oppression because they help to strengthen the stereotypes that keep people oppressed. And yeah, well, this is a long enough answer. That's how I said I wouldn't speak on behalf of agendered people, so perhaps I shouldn't speak on behalf of gender critical people. But from where I'm standing, that's as much as I can make out of what's going on in their heads. And a lot of it I find quite comprehensible. I just think that, well, there needs to be more listening on both sides, really.
So one sort of like sentiment that I feel, and maybe this is more from, not from the gender critical crowd, but from sort of conservatives in the United States, is that it's like, things are changing really fast, and like how do other people get to decide this and we don't, or something like that. Like that there's a sense of feeling disempowered because there's some conversation going on, that they're not part of, right? Where a bunch of terms are getting redefined and they're
Yeah.
not part of that process.
Yeah.
And I think that, like, this, for me, this is one of the things that makes conceptual engineering politically difficult.
Yeah.
Is like, how do we all do it together? How
Yeah.
does it not become like a battle over who gets to do it?
Yeah. I think it's interesting that you mentioned power and disempowerment. I'm a Christian myself, but I'm probably about to be a good deal less charitable towards the conservative Christians than I've just been towards the gender criticals, and that wasn't very charitable even to them. I think that a big difference between the UK and the US is that in the US you have an enormously powerful church, which in many ways is a real force for good. That's the first thing to say. They do a tremendous amount of good. As usual, though, I mean, Christianity always seems to do both tremendous good and tremendous harm. And the church in the US is a very, very powerful body, enormously wealthy, enormously strong, enormous depths of loyalty amongst huge crowds of adherents. And when you get into cult thinking, and religion always tends that way. Religion always has to, if it's going to stay healthy, it has to push itself away from that. And there's a real good sense, a real good common sense, I think, in Jesus saying to a lot of people who approached him, you should just get rid of your money, get away from your money. Your money is destroying you. And given that in Britain the church is really, in many ways, wobbling around, looking pretty feeble, and above all, looking poor, the most striking thing about the US church is how rich it is, and from a British point of view. And actually, I do feel a certain superiority there over the American church. I think it's not a good thing that they're so wealthy and they're so powerful. What cult leaders always do is they want to get their followers to stand on their heads, or, wear orange wigs and run down the street naked, or whatever, no matter how stupid. They just want the power to get them to do it. And with a lot of the evangelical leaders, all this stuff about Harry Potter, and it's ridiculous nonsense about it being demonic or whatever. You have to burn your Harry Potter books, or the devil will enter into you. I think it's just a way of getting people to stand on their heads and, say yes sir, no sir, 3 bags full sir, which just demonstrates the power of the cult over the individual mind. And I think there's a lot of that going on with conservative attitudes to sexuality and gender. So the automatic assumption that we transgender people are a new thing, and B, and not just but also so, given that we're new, we must be bad. The automatic assumption that that's how it must be just strikes me as a defensive mentality. They're walled in their own little world. We don't fit in it, and therefore, because we're not familiar, we're threatening.
We're gonna move to Q&A in a minute. So Tyler, if you can pull up someone from the question. I just wanted to say that that reason the thing you just gave about wealth, that is actually the reason Plato gives in that passage in the Phaedo about the body. What he says is the problem with the body is that it makes us have wars and stuff because we care about wealth. And we care about wealth, like it's our desire for wealth in a way that enslaves us to our bodies. So,
like in the Republic, we can't be content to stick with the City of Pigs. We've got to go on from there. We've got to have luxuries as well. Yes.
Okay. So, Tyler, I assume you're pulling some up. And I want to say, while we're waiting for the person to come up, if you're up on the screen, we might pull you up while we're still answering the previous question. So we'll be ignoring you. But that's just sit tight, and because that way it goes more smoothly if we have you waiting. So don't worry if we haven't, if you're on the screen but we haven't gotten to you yet. I'll signal you when it's time for you to ask your question. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Catherine.
Hi. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I really, really like this conversation. I think this is super interesting. So I have lots of questions, but I'll just limit it to the 2 that I posted. The The first is something that you both kind of started talking about earlier on, about this like three-pronged thing about those who don't understand, those who are non-binary, those who believe in binary, and those who are trans, or something along those lines. And I'm of the opinion that gender is performative and not at all essential to who someone is. But when I've talked to other trans people, they tend to express the thought to me that gender is essential to who they are, and that doesn't match their bodies, but their gender, them as a gendered being, is essential to who they are. And so I was wondering about your thoughts about gender as either essential to being human versus something that is constructed and performative. And then the second part, and Agnes, you mentioned that some good could come out of like shooting for this idea of gender and how to do something in a gendered way. I was curious about what you meant by that. And then the second question is transgender or being a transgender person at all about gender, or could it be about sex because it is so embodied? And to me, gender is, again, performative, whereas sex is very much about the body.
Which of us goes first, Agnes?
You go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Catherine. That's a very interesting question. There's a lot to get hold of there. So, first of all, I think we're actually a little hamstrung by our lack of vocabulary in this area, because we have the two words sex and gender, which often get mixed up. Sex is ambiguous between meaning the configuration of your body and meaning the activity that people love engaging in on Saturday nights. It's unfortunate that sex, and so more broadly, it's ambiguous between sex, the thing that people do, and sex, the discrimination that people fall on one side or the other of. And then there's also sex, meaning sexuality, meaning your general sense of yourself as a sexual being. So sex is an unhelpfully indiscriminate word. Then gender, which used to be a synonym for sex in the sense of the biological division, is now, I think, is a concept where perhaps things have got a bit confused, where it would be good to have more engineering just to sort out the rather building sitey mess that we've got ourselves into with that term. So can you be a transgender person without actually believing in gender? Yes, you can. And I think that's a crucial thing to understand. That I think if there's an essential concept, an essentialist concept in here, it's probably not gender, meaning a second layer of who you are alongside the shape of your body. It's more like your sense of yourself in the world. And that can go a number of ways. And your sense of your bodily being. I'm thinking of the work of people like Merleau-Ponty here. So your sense of yourself, your sense of yourself as a person in the world can include your sense that your body is one way and you think it should be another. And when you're like that, with specific respect to your sex, in your biological sex, then you are someone who's transgender. So can you be transgender without being, without even believing in gender? Yes, you can. I think I'm pretty close to that condition myself. I certainly agree with you, Catherine, that gender is performative. It's a social role, is the way I'd put it. It's a thing that we learn. We learn to be blue or pink. We learn to wear frilly clothes or lumberjack shirts, depending on whether we're, whatever. Yes, in that sense, the term transgender is an unfortunate one, because the word does seem to suggest if I'm transgender, and if there is such a thing as transgenderism, as some people seem to think, then it must be that we believe in gender. And then you get this idea that there's a thing called gender ideology, and this really is a term which is used for all sorts of witch hunts and all sorts of scapegoating of people. and scaremongering. So there's supposed to be this dreadful thing out there called gender ideology, which people who are hostile will suppose I'm trying to impose on you right now. I don't believe there's any such thing. And in particular, I mean, there may be people who have strange ideas about gender, and those ideas, to go disjunctive again, might apply to them, certainly don't apply to me. I see no need for those beliefs in pink brains and blue brains or whatever, beliefs in, natural stereotypes for men and women to fall into. I don't believe in any of that. And I think the use of gender ideology as a term to get scaremongering going is absolutely pernicious and ought to stop. If I have a gender ideology, it comes down to this. Some people are perfectly content with their bodies the way they were born. Some people have a deep sense, an abiding sense, and sometimes an absolute anguish that they find themselves in one shape of body and they want to be in the other. And then the question is what to do about that, how to live with it, how to cope with it, how to stay sane, if that's your condition. And the best answer turns out to be that if you're in my state, then you should live as a woman, and that's what being a trans woman is. Is that a gender ideology? I don't know. I mean, it seems to me pretty lightweight for an ideology. So that was a really long answer to your question, Catherine. I think I've covered the main things you said. I hope so. My notes suggest that I have. Could be wrong.
I wanted to add one thing just to clarify. I don't know how much it will actually clarify, but I guess I'm not sure I understand the idea. Hey, Sarah, we'll get to you in just a sec. I'm not sure I understand the idea of gender as performative. Like, I sort of understand it from the word a little bit. I've read some of the relevant material. But like, I guess I really don't like to think of myself as acting. I mean, I get that in a lot of modes of life, there are just like conventions that we follow, right? Like I drive on a certain side of the road. And so that's sort of like, that's a convention. But I suppose my hope is that there can be something I can inquire into and something that can come to light and be understood, and like through my gender, like that I can mobilize it like I would want to mobilize everything about myself to understand the world better. And Sophie-Grace, I mean, you're right that like I think I don't quite mobilize everything about myself, like not my height or something, So but for me, it feels to me like potentially something where it's an avenue of learning. And I think that somehow it's like, if my choice is like, performance, or like I'm fated to be limited in these ways or whatever, okay, I'll pick performance between those two, but like I don't really like my options there.
I think it's a key thing about human beings. Sorry, Sarah, I'll try and keep this brief. It's a key thing about human beings that we're role-playing animals, and we pick up scripts from other people. What do you call this noise in America? What's that in America? In Britain, it's a raspberry.
Raspberry, yeah.
That's blowing a raspberry. Okay, it's the same. My brother has recently become a grandfather, and his son, my nephew, is the father of a little girl called Ada, who's about 6 months old. And Christopher, my nephew, is blowing raspberries at her, and she's just started blowing them back. And that's tremendously exciting. That's a real developmental stage. And here's why. Because being a human being is about learning that there are scripts that you can involve yourself in performing, and you can express yourself through performing. So here's a deep antithesis that everybody seems to believe in. Either you're following a routine or you're original. And if you're original, then you don't follow a routine. You throw away the script. You do your own new thing. But actually, the truth is that we express ourselves. We are individual through following, and of course, subverting and amending and changing and mixing scripts. That's what we do. So, just learning to blow raspberries is a little example of that. And all the time from our parents, we're learning how to be in the world. We're learning scripts to follow. You see children doing this all the time at play. So children are pretending to tell each other off, because telling someone off is a kind of social interaction that they've seen their parents engaging in with them, and they start practicing doing it to each other, because that's how humans express themselves. So, going from thoughts about raspberries and children telling each other off, I hope you can see where gender fits into this. There are associated with the idea of being a woman, of being a man, and indeed with being a trans woman, there are associated with those identities particular kinds of roles and scripts, and we express ourselves by following them out. And none of us does it quite the same way, just as there have never been two identical performances of Hamlet. Though actors too are expressing themselves by following literal scripts, this is what humans do. We are role-playing, script-following animals. And it's not, I'd want to reassure Agnes, it's not in the least bit inauthentic to do this. It's not acting in a pejorative sense. It's just what humans do.
Hi,
Sarah.
Sarah.
Sorry, you've been very patient while I've witted on.
No problem at all.
It's great
Thank
to
you
see
both for holding this conversation today. Thank you as well. I'm just going to ask one of the questions that I have on the chat here. And it goes back to something that both of you have already touched on a little bit earlier. And I kind of pulled this directly off of the ad for the Night Owls event. So why do clothes matter? And why, like, what does it mean to have like a look that works for you? And I asked the question very sympathetically because over the summer, you know, I've struggled quite a bit with gender stuff, and I also have this like very deeply ingrained like ascetic impulse, and I don't even know where it came from. Where I just want to say it should not matter what I look like, it should not matter what kind of clothes I wear, it should not matter how my hair looks. There's just something like, maybe it's the soul thing where it's the soul is inside. I don't know. I would never put it that way. But this impulse to just say, you know what, it really doesn't matter. And then I cut my hair over the summer and it was like an instant change in my life for some reason. And I totally was not expecting it. And so clearly, I mean, I was shocked. Clearly it does matter in some way. I still can't articulate why. And I know that neither of you maybe have an answer, but ideas are also welcome. Like, why does this matter?
Yeah, I think my answer would begin from thinking about roles and scripts again. I think it's a key part of our presentation of ourselves in the world, how we dress and how we look. And so if I ever had such a thing as a philosophy of haute couture, this is where it would begin from. The fact that we present ourselves in the world through our clothes. And of course it's possible to think, well, this is all stuff and nonsense, and this is all secondary. This is literally just ornamentation. This is cosmetics. I mean, there's a very rude bit in Plato about cosmetics, and about cookery too. They come up in the Gorgias as false techni, as false forms of skill. And no one, according to Plato, should be bothering themselves in the least with this. And Plato is very ascetic indeed about all of that.
Sophie-Grace, I'm sorry, I just have to interrupt and tell you that Sarah's in the class with me, and we just discussed this yesterday. This exact thing of the Gorgias.
Sarah, just out of interest, was that actually in your mind in asking the question? The thing about cosmetics in the Gorgias?
No, it wasn't, but
right.
Yes, so relevant, and thank you for drawing my attention to that.
I mean, to speculate, I bet this is what Plato would have said about clothes. The same things as he says about cosmetics. He would have said it was bad to be interested in this, and you shouldn't be. So why does it matter? It matters because it's a way of expressing ourselves. It's a role that we can fit ourselves into. And that's what humans do. They say, this is who I am, by finding a public way of human expression, which has a tradition to it, which has some past. The past is enormously important to us humans, and all the time we're taking on the past that we choose. And I mean, one of the things that happened in the 1960s, back when I was born, actually, when I was a small child, one of the things that happened in the 1960s in British music was everyone said, we're throwing away all that stuff, all that moldy old stuff from the past. We're going to have a completely new music founded on African music. So, I mean, they didn't throw up history. They got a different history in. And they said, this now expresses who we feel we are. This expresses who we want to be. We're going to go with this, not Gildas and Sullivan and Flanders and Swan. We're going to go for this, for the blues, for American music, Black American music. That's where we're going. And we make choices like that all the time about who we are, about what we want to be. And there can be, to touch on another gender critical nerve, there can be an element of appropriation about this, in a bad sense of appropriation. Sure, there can. Sure, it can be bad in that way. Why do clothes matter? Well, there's another interesting group of people here. I had a friend, I have a friend, he's still around, I just haven't seen him for a bit, who revealed to me after a while that he was a naturist. So, you know, there are nude beaches that you can go to. If you go to a nude beach in Scotland, in my opinion, you probably deserve a medal, though where to pin it is another problem. But some people take this, it's kind of parallel to being agender, about clothes. You say, look, the whole thing is unimportant. The whole thing is a distraction, or the whole thing is bad. We need to get rid of it. The real us is the naked us, and we should get away from clothes and go that way. Well, yeah, you could in a sufficiently warm climate. But that kind of strip down to the basics, get rid of roles, get rid of clothes approach doesn't appeal to me, because I do actually believe in the stuff I've been talking about roles. And so I think that we are always expressing ourselves through roles, and that's not inauthentic. It's a good thing. It's the way we are. It's the way we have to be. And to think that by throwing away all roles, you'd get down to some naked you, which is the real you, I think that's a kind of mistake. And I think, I mean, I can't, perhaps there's an angry naturist in the audience now. Perhaps I've offended someone. I hope not, and I don't mean to. But I think that kind of mistake can be there. It's a kind of Protestant purity where we get rid of all distractions and all superimposed layers. We get down to the ultimate reality at the bottom. And it can be, sorry, this is a cliche of thought, but I think it applies here. It can be the rings of an onion. It can be getting down to a kind of nothing in the middle. The layers were you. Sorry, Sarah, that was, again, a long answer, but I hope it helped.
That's a good answer. I have some thoughts about this too. I think for me, it's like, on the one hand, there are aspects of traditional feminine dress that have never appealed to me for a variety of reasons. So like high heels, even any heel I can't wear because I have a severed Achilles tendon. Makeup, I can't stand the feeling of it. I don't like clothing that's uncomfortable. I don't like anything that's like restricting my stomach. Like and I'm very sensitive to all those things. So like I have very low tolerance. And I went to religious schools where I had to like wear tights that made my legs feel itchy all the time, you know? And so like, on the one hand, I want to say like, there are all these, you know, so there's sort of a script for dressing as a woman that I don't like. But for me, it's very liberating to be like, I can still dress as a woman without following that script. And so like, that is, the choices aren't that script versus like, don't care about your clothes or something. I care a lot about my clothes. And that like, there's actually so much space. It's sort of, for me, there would be no way of discovering that space without actually concretely like finding the clothing that fits into that space is what it is to discover that space. And
I think,
and just one last thing, which is that like, for me, like, visual complexity is really important to me, like on a day-by-day, moment-by-moment basis. Like I want everything to be colorful all the time, and like I'm just happier if that's what I'm looking at. And so that, go ahead.
I think with me, two other things I can say to Sarah's question. First of all, why do clothes? Why is it about the clothes? First answer, because that's the easiest thing to change, and it's really a lot easier than making difficult decisions about hormones and surgery and that kind of thing. The body is very difficult and painful to change, and if you're in a marriage to a cis woman a straight cis woman who didn't sign up for all this kind of thing when she married me, because she didn't know that was what she was getting, and I didn't know either. I mean, I wasn't fooling her, I wasn't deceiving her. I just didn't understand myself at that stage. So you might, how can I put this? You might have reasons for not wanting to go too far on that kind of aspect. And you might think, well, I do need to express this side of myself or I will go crazy or commit suicide or something. I've got to express this side of myself. What's the easiest way of doing it? Well, clothes are. And actually also I can, without breaching anyone else's confidentiality, I can mention a medical reason here, which is I have a dodgy left knee. And one effect of hormones is to decrease muscle mass. And I think if the muscle mass on my left knee was decreased, my left knee would just fall apart. So I'm not very keen to go that way. And so I'm enormously dissatisfied. I am basically pretty dissatisfied with the way I look, the way I am. I'd like to be a lot more feminine. But I also think that wherever we come out with this, it's going to be a compromise. And then the question is, which compromise do you want to make? And how many costs do you want to pay? For what effect? And, well, this is where I ended up. And the other thing about clothes, the way I dress, is I just thought, there's a look here that not many cis women actually do. And I can do it. It works for me. And I like it. So why not? Why not do that? And that's how I ended up looking like I do.
Eric, hi.
Hi, everybody. My question was very similar to what Catherine had, so I'm going to maybe adjust or do a follow-up because that kind of idea of identity around body, which you did split up in like, I like my body, this is great, I'm not happy with my body, and then maybe I'm whatever about my body, right? And then that is distinct from, I think, then the conversation earlier continued about Agnes talking about what does it mean to be woman, which feels very separate also from body. And then in the chat, we were talking a little about this language around sex and gender, how transgender, someone was saying, well, how does someone who identifies as transgender doesn't really think about gender as a thing or would be happy without gender? And you were speaking a little bit about that there. And so I do wonder if some of the language is kind of confusing to us. I identify as a cisgender male and also, perform that somewhat more than other ways. But then what Agnes was talking about in terms of the womanhood performing that, these are very distinct, I think, even though the language of gender comes in there. So I want to kind of hear a little bit about that, more about kind of like putting behind, or how does that be confusing maybe for you or as all of us as a society? Because it is, you're kind of talking about how we agree with or disagree with our bodies, which somehow can only get played out in how we present ourselves physically in the world, and how the language kind of maybe gets messy in the midst of that. And then more of Agnes is like trying to be a woman, be a man, be a XYZ, QW, within that. So
thanks, Eric. Yes, so one thing that happens a lot is I say things which appear to be intention, and that is not for Walt Whitman reasons exactly. It's not just I am large, I contain multitudes. Although I think it probably is that there are a lot of different. It is I am large in this sense. There are lots of feelings in play, and they can go in different directions. So there's a wonderful passage in Jan Morris's marvelous book on being transgender, Conundrum, which I recommend to you if you haven't read it. Conundrum came out, I think, in the 70s, and it's about someone who was aware that he originally, she later, was transgender, was actually a trans woman, and about what Jan Morris did to go from being James Morris to end up as Jan Morris, and all the difficulties of that journey. There's a wonderful passage where she describes when she was a young man, if we can put it that way. She was one of the journalists who was on the successful Everest expedition of 1953. And she has this marvelous description of the power and force of her body in the mountains, in the Himalayas. So she's charging down from Camp 1 on Everest to base camp. And she's going down the Everest ice, the Khumbu icefall. It's an enormously dangerous and difficult bit of mountaineering. And she says, I loved having a young, strong male body. That was marvelous. and there's nothing like it. There's been nothing like it in my life since. Now, I don't think it necessarily has to be a male body, but certainly there is an exhilaration in being able to do things with your body, which I have. I'm not a particularly good mountaineer, but I've been very lucky in my partners, and I've had some wonderful times. I was skiing in the Cairngorms yesterday, and there is an exhilaration in what you can do physically with your body. And so in that sense, I'm very happy with the body I've got, because it enables me to go mountaineering until the knee gives out. So that's one thing that I feel about living in this body of mine. Another thing I feel is that there is a kind of, distaste or disappointment or revulsion or something like that. Just seeing myself in the mirror with no clothes on. I don't want to be like that. And there is not very much that I'm prepared to do about it, more than I already do. And, that is the most basic difficulty. And it is. It's not a happy feeling, but at least I can do something about it before. Whereas when I was younger, there was just this dysphoria, body dysphoria, and anguish because I had no way of coping with it, no strategies or remedies for that. I was just stuck. And that really does cause an awful lot of anguish to an awful lot of people. So, there are certainly those two feelings. And I'm not sure I've quite got hold of the rest of Eric's question here, but that's certainly part of what I want to say in answer to it. And I think the latter half of Eric's question was about sorting out our terminology. I think Eric's absolutely right. We need to do that. And it's not clear how.
Is it right, or is it somewhat right, to consider being transgender a disability?
I could get myself in hot water, whatever I say to that. I think that, there are people who are transgender who say they're perfectly happy to be transgender. And in one way, that's something I say about myself. There are things I don't like about my condition, but overall, would I have chosen any other path? No, I wouldn't. Absolutely not. If you could give me a magic wand to wave now to become biologically female right now, would I wave it? Of course I would. But on the other hand, do I wish I'd been born biologically female? Well, in this sense, no, because if we run with those counterfactuals, then I'm not married to the person I'm married to, and I don't have the children I've got. And who knows what goes on in possible worlds? They're deeply murky places. But I can't make my commitment to my family and my children, my wife and my children, conditional. Can't do that. Not going there. That's just not an option. So in that sense, because I wouldn't be in this marriage with those children unless I had been born biologically male, I don't want to change that either. At any rate, not back then. Maybe now, but not back then.
Yeah, I guess I see that the question, would you want to change it, is one way to get a grip on the concept of disability. And I think, like, I was thinking about, my uncle who died a few years ago, he had cerebral palsy. And like, I just think he lived with a very strong sense of he didn't have the body he wanted to have. And this is partly like growing up in Hungary, in like the 60s, and there not being like ramps anywhere ever. So like feeling like his body was not fitted to the world that he lived in. And that's it seems like that's precisely the bit that Morris doesn't have, right? Like, so it's the other part. But it's, I hadn't thought of being transgender sort of as a version of that. I don't know what he would have said about, like, if he could have been born without cerebral palsy. Like, it depends on which point in his life, because obviously he'd had made connections and whatever too. But I guess it's just a difficult question in the theory of disability. Generally,
it is. I see people who write about disability and people who are disabled struggling a great deal with this question. I think it's a really hard question to answer. But then, of course, if there's nothing that you would change about your situation if you could, then some people will take the quick and dirty route there and say, well, you're not disabled then, or you're not afflicted if you wouldn't change it, which I think is false, actually. But thinking of transgender, and this is, I think, parallel with disability, thinking of it just as an affliction is wrong. It's not just an affliction. It is an affliction in some ways, but it's also a gift. So maybe I think it's a bit like Greta Thunberg describing being Asperger's as being her superpower. I know exactly what she means. Being transgender gives me a perspective on the world that I wouldn't otherwise have. And it's neither a cis man's nor a cis woman's perspective. And I sometimes think what transgender people, or some of us, should do, I sometimes think that what we should do is just get people to recognize us and validate us as being what we are, and not treat us as if we were, some kind of not entirely successful attempt at the target of being women. So, I mean, another thing that disabled people and that their allies say is that it's not our bodies that need to change; it's the world that needs to change. It's not, this building. It's not you are disabled, you can't get into this building. It's this building is the thing that's wrong. This building should have been designed differently. And if you thought it was okay to design a building into which there is no way of a person in a wheelchair getting, then you were wrong, and you shouldn't have thought that. And I think there are analogues of that kind of thought for transgender people. The world should, sorry, this sounds awfully victim-y, but the world should not be so hostile to us. I think that's true. There's just no need for it. Things don't have to be like that. So let's not. I just put the light on because it's going dark here. And I can't see the notes I'm taking.
I did have a follow-up there, but I want to hear Tyler is going to read someone's question, and maybe we'll get back to it.
Hi, Tyler.
I think you're muted.
He's gone.
Follow up then. Something I sometimes wonder is like, so you have there was this nice bit that you said in an interview where transitioning, you said you lost some of your stake in the status quo. And you said, society maybe needs to be remade from the foundations. Why is it so inhospitable to humans? And something I wonder about is like, I do think that maybe, I think that some of that's absolutely right, but I also wonder, how much do you just think of suffering and affliction as part of the human condition? Like just.
Oh, yes. We're all bound to suffer and to be afflicted in various ways, but so much of it is completely gratuitous, and so much of it is quite unnecessarily inflicted on people by people who gain nothing from that infliction, nothing real. I mean, of course they have status games and money games that they're playing, which is why they do it, but they don't actually gain anything worth having from that. And I think it's tragic that our society is so organized around the welfare of the rich and no one else's welfare. There are a lot of people, well, there aren't a lot of people, there's a small minority, there's a 3% who've had an awfully good pandemic. And the millionaires and billionaires have done very nicely, thank you, out of this human crisis, whilst other people have been driven to the wall and been made absolutely desperate. The rich people have got richer, and that, I think, is deeply offensive, and it doesn't help anyone. It really is. It doesn't even help them. They can't even tell how much money they've got. They've got so much money, and it's just like a computer game, getting even richer when already so rich that if they lived 500 lifetimes on the most lavish scale, they can never get through the money they've got. So Yeah, I do think that we urgently need to look each other in the eye as human beings and say, well, each of us is here for only 80 years if we're lucky. Well, what can we do to make everyone have as good a time as possible while they're here? And I don't think society is at all organized towards that. And when you come out as trans, a phenomenon that happens that could not happen without bad attitudes being there present in society is that you do see people looking down their noses at you and excluding you and putting you on the wrong side of various lines. And of course, I am in no way socially excluded in the way that many, many people in both Britain and America are. I'm very privileged. I'm a philosophy professor. I'm not badly off. I'm extremely lucky. But in just this respect, I suddenly see in just little glimpses of what it's like to live as a socially excluded person. And yeah, it does move me a few notches to the left politically to see that.
I'm going to read Hayden's question because Tyler, somehow it's not working for the unmuting. So
Hang in there, Tyler.
Yeah, this is the question. Is there a kind of tension between trans identity, which seems to depend on a gender binary, and other queer discourses focused on deconstructing binary gender conventions and decoupling aesthetic customs from physiology?
Yes, if transgender to you was about working with the gender binary, then yes, all those consequences would follow. Because I'm not committed to that, I don't think, because I'm not committed to the gender binary, I don't think I'm committed to this kind of bad consequence, and I agree it's a bad consequence. But for me, and here I'll say something that sometimes gets you virtually stoned in transgender circles, but sorry and everything, I think it's true that human biological sex is basically dimorphic. And it's that dimorphism that I'm talking about in my understanding of transgender, the fact that biologically people do come into biological sexes. And of course, there are A, intersex cases, and B, a whole cluster of different criteria for counting someone as male or female biologically. And those different criteria can and do come apart in some cases. All of that I acknowledge. But I think one bit of Aristotelian philosophy that's always useful to remember is the distinction between a universal quantification and a generic. There are lots of truths in the world which are not universal quantifications, but they are generic truths. Humans have 32 teeth, dogs have 4 legs. Those are both true, but any of us can find a 3-legged dog if we try without too much trouble. I think a Google search would turn up pictures of 3-legged dogs in about 10 seconds. And I am, as it happens, a 31-toothed human being. But these are generic claims. They're not meant to be true of every single case without exception. They're not meant to be exceptionless. They're meant to say what happens always or for the most part. And that, I think, is true of sexual dimorphism. And because what transgender, as I understand it, is about, is basically being born one side of that dimorphism and wishing you were on the other. And wishing is perhaps too weak a word, longing to be on the other. Since that's what transgender is about, I don't think we're dealing here with a bad kind of constructive account of gender which gets oppressive. Of course, there's oppression in the offing. And of course, some of it is based in differences in the body. So it's an important point about male and female bodies, and this is another Aristotelian generic, that by and large males are stronger than females. And that fact about differential in bodily power is, I think, the basic truth, the basic physical truth, at the difference in the political status of men and women in most societies. So the oppression comes from there, and I think the way we normally use gendered concepts comes from there. And that's why gendered concepts are so much of the time instruments of oppression. I think the gender criticals are just right about that. I'm a gender critical too, in that sense. Am I critical of the notion of gender? Hell yes.
Hi, Luke.
Hello.
Luke?
My question is, what is there some correlation between feeling comfortable or wanting to have a female or a male body and following feminine or masculine gender norms? And if you think it's explainable entirely as a result of social pressures, or if there is something in some cases that causes, aside from a social pressure, that causes some correlation between male or female identity and masculinity and femininity?
Right, great question. I think there is a correlation, and I think the mediating notion is the question that transgender people ask themselves. Well, everybody asks themselves, but particularly transgender people. Okay, this is my sense of myself. How am I going to express that? That's the key question. Because as soon as you ask that question, then the most obvious way for you to express it is via the roles and scripts that your society already has prepared. And so, I mean, it doesn't have to be like that. You can imagine someone saying, well, my sense of myself is that I'm a trans woman, and therefore I'm going to live in this way and that way, which I define as living in a feminine way. No one else does, but I don't care. I'm going to do it this way anyway, and I say that's feminine. Now, there are people who do something like that, and good luck to them. It seems to me a perfectly legitimate choice. Most of us steer a bit closer to the norms because, like I was saying before, human beings are role-playing creatures. We're script-following creatures, and that's how we express ourselves. But of course, that too is a generic. It's not true that everybody expresses themselves in that way. Some people express themselves by, and this is kind of like Dadaism in art. People go to the extreme of throwing away the conventions for expressing yourself as their conventional way of expressing themselves.
Yeah, it occurs. That's a great question. It occurs to me that, like, you were talking about like the magic button that would make you biologically female. Like, it's possible if there were such a button, that is, if it did not involve like all the things that surgery involves, right? If there
Yeah.
was such a button for trans women generally, then that would then the sort of distribution you would get in terms of dress and whatever might be like the distribution of women in that domain as well. But that given that there isn't the button, like some of that work is being done by, say, clothing. Does that seem right?
I think maybe that's yes. I think the answer is yes to that. I think the clothing does do quite a lot of the work, but I was a little distracted because what you were saying was making me think of a scenario for a science fiction film. Suppose everyone had a button like that, and everyone could choose at any moment to live in the other gender, in the other sex, in the other biological sex, for 24 hours or a month or a week or the rest of their lives or whatever they liked. What would happen if we had that capacity? Some people, I'm sure, particularly male to female, would just swap over for a day out of something like prurience. Some people would do it not for sexual motives, but out of curiosity. I think almost everybody. Well, interesting question. We can't do a show of hands, unfortunately, but I'd love to ask all of the 364 people in this session, if you had a button that would change your biological sex, and which you could press again to change back whenever you wanted, would you press it? That would be the first question. I'd love to know how many hands would go up for that. And how long would you press it for? So would you go for on-off sessions, being today I'm a man, tomorrow I'm a woman, the day after I'm a man again? Would you go for on-off like that? Or would you just switch and stay, which is what I'd do? What would you do? And another question, what would be the social consequences of this? Where would this get us 20 years down the line? How would our concepts of gender have changed? I have written a little science fiction story of my own, which is a bit Ursula Le Guinish, a bit like The Left Hand of Darkness. I have written a little science fiction story of my own about a thoroughly matriarchal society where the thing that you're meant to be is not a man, but a woman. You're meant to be a woman. And there are various ways of falling short of that ideal. So some people talk about old-fashioned Western societies as not the gender binary, but the gender unary. You're supposed to be a man, and there are various ways of falling short of that. And I think this is very clear, for example, in that simple fact of language, that man, historically, means human being, and also means male member of the human species. That is the gender unary in action, and Aristotle's biology is full of the gender unary. So suppose we had a gender unary, but it was female. What would happen? And I have a little story called Lysunus, which is about that possibility. And I have to say, it is, of course, a society which is oppressive in certain respects, and it's particularly oppressive to trans men, because they're people who are born with female bodies, and they want to live as men. Why on earth would you want to do that? But anyway, there are lots of interesting ideas here to explore, and I think we should make a pitch to Hollywood as soon as possible for a film about this on-off gender button. I think that'd be such a cool film if we could get that swinging.
I think Tyler's working on the poll, but it'll appear in the bottom of your screen in a minute.
I can see a little button that says polls.
Yes, there's an old one on there.
Oh, right.
And Tyler's adding another one for this question. So, but
right.
Meanwhile, hi, Lauren.
Hello. Yeah, I start just because I can't resist. It reminds me your this fascinating idea of the switch button. When my uncle was first trying to explain the concept of transgender to me, he explained it as if, imagine that you were in a male body, how would you feel? And for whatever reason, the first thing I said was, well, I would go down to the male clothing store and I would buy some good male clothing. And I was like, what? Why can't I can just do that whenever I want? Why is this?
Yeah.
And anyway, so the investigation made me think, but whatever. Interesting question. Thank you for having this whole discussion. It's wonderful. But I just have a question about the language that we use to describe gender identity and how we can use this language in such a way that we minimize the extent to which we constrain others when we're positing ourselves. Because I understand that whenever you're defining something, you're unfortunately sort of constraining it at the same time. But of course, some definitions are much more constraining than others. And so when I come across a statement, for example, the statement someone might say, I'm non-binary because I don't identify with womanhood. I look at the statement and it sort of perplexes me because inside the statement is the claim that women are those who identify with womanhood, which depending on how you define womanhood can be something that's quite insulting to women, because if womanhood is defined as this, patriarchal image of how we should act, feel, even the idea that there is this category can be, constraining, but specifically the content of the category. And so I'm wondering if you have any ideas about like how we can improve the way we use language so that when we are making statements about ourselves, we are not accidentally putting huge generalizations about whole categories of people when we make positive or negative statements. So,
right. I'm not sure. I'm not sure is the answer, Laura. I think it's a tricky problem. I think one thing that's important here is that the speaker has a duty to avoid buying into systems of oppression by the way they talk. That's true. It's also true that the listener has a duty not to interpret the speaker too uncharitably. And I think sometimes this is a problem. I mean, trans people can be guilty of this, and other marginalized groups can be guilty of this too, because we've been, a bit traumatized, a bit sensitized to difficulties in language. We can sometimes be uncharitable hearers of people who speak, meaning no harm at all by it. I mean, my climbing partner sometimes says to me, because when I climb, I don't try to present as feminine. I just go and climb, and you wear what you need to wear to survive in the Scottish winter. You're not interested in how you look. You're interested in whether you're warm. So my climbing partner, who's a bit of an old school Englishman, sometimes says to me, "Well done, sir." And I'm not going to object to that, sir. because I know him and he's a good friend. He's someone I love deeply. I'm very happy to be climbing with him, and it simply doesn't matter. So language doesn't always have to pierce us to the heart. And sometimes when we can see bad implications in something that someone says, the right reaction is to say, look, it's not meant to hurt you. It's not meant to wound you. It may wound you a bit, but it's not meant that way. We have very little time for our words. I mean, the part of what I'm getting at here is we have very little time to speak, and context is so important, and charitable willingness to hear the other and not to judge them for a bad way that what they say could be taken, I think is important too. That isn't a very substantive answer in the way of positive proposals about how to change our language, and I'm sorry, because I'm not entirely sure what to say. I think one thing that's very good is the practice that people now have of putting pronouns on bios. I don't do this myself. On the only bio that I run regularly is my Twitter bio, and I'm deliberately indirect in what I say there. I actually describe myself as a cultural Marxist transgender penguin. And that is really, well, it's a joke. It's a silly joke, referring back to that story. I don't know if you saw it on Fox or something, where some anchor woman got terribly worked up about the fact that the penguins in Edinburgh Zoo, one of them was not behaving either like a normal male penguin or a female penguin. So Edinburgh Zoo gave it a they pronoun. And Fox News got their knickers completely in a twist about this one morning. And so there's a rather splendid rant about the evil transgender penguins and how the wicked people at Edinburgh Zoo were coming for your kids. So I went with that. But this is a tangent to a tangent. What I was meaning to say was that people put pronouns in bios, and though I don't do it myself, I think that's a good thing to do. And I think that is useful because it shows us how we don't have to start with heavy-duty assumptions about people which aren't helpful. I mean, here's another parallel from the case of gay people. It used to be the case 30 years ago, in Britain at any rate, that everyone was normally assumed to be heterosexual. And if you turned out to be gay, sensation. Wow, you're gay. Sharp intake of breath. And that was even from gay-friendly people. Whereas these days, no one would dream of assuming that someone you don't know particularly well must necessarily be heterosexual or homosexual. We simply don't make assumptions about that. And that, I think, is far healthier.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about language is that on the one hand, we want people to be able to articulate their private experiences and to say in some sense that they have a kind of authority, kind of testimonial authority. And on the other hand, language is common and shared, and we can only do that insofar as we have some shared sense of what the words mean and even of what the experiences are. Right. And so but this is helping me to understand something, because for any kind of politically fraught issue, there's always some bit of it that touches on language, I tend to find, right? Like there's pro-choice and pro-life. There's not anti-choice and anti-life, right? So that's already a linguistic framing there. There was the period where people didn't want gay marriage, they wanted it to be called something else, right? And there's this sense that I think like I've sometimes had, like, why are these battles over language? But language really matters in the sense that it is our common ground, right? And when there are very many linguistic battles, as there are with trans identity, there are, even in the chat, people have been like, well, why is it not transsexual as opposed to transgender, right? These linguistic issues are marks of the fact that we sort of are not getting along, in the sense that we don't quite have a sense of like the common space, right? And we're working that out, and language is one of the places where we can see that being worked out.
And I think going back to something I was saying earlier, I think that it's very important for us to give people room to say where they're coming from. And I think I think there was an earlier phase in my thinking where I hadn't realized what I was doing and where I was imposing my understanding of what it is to be transgender as the norm, and where I was saying, well, this is what it's like for me, so this is what it must be like in general. And I mean, I must get some credit for having realized I was doing this and stopped doing it when I realized. But I think it's very easy for us to do that, all of us, in all sorts of ways. We say, this is how I see the world, so this is how the world is. So that must be the way it is for everyone. And it simply ain't so. I think there is, as I've said before, but it bears repetition, I think there is a basic defining sentence which you speak if you're transgender and not if you're not. And the sentence is, my sense of my body is that I have this body on one side of the biological dimorphism, and I wish I had the body on the other side of that biological dimorphism. That's the basic sentence. But accounts of why that's true, we don't have to pick on just one. And I think this really matters when we get to people who are into heavy gatekeeping and who say, in effect, whether they mean to or not, what the political import of what they say is, if you want to be a transgender person in a society that we're controlling, you have to convince us. Before you can be a transgender person, you have to show us that it's all right for you to be that. And that is an absolutely terrible thing to say. And the push against gender ideology seems a lot of the time to be saying, well, we don't find your explanation of who you are convincing. Go away and get a better theory, or we won't let you be yourself. You can't be yourself until you've got a better theory. Now, I don't know if there's anyone here who happens to go to the trouble of wading through all the stuff I churn out in ethics, but a central theme in my ethical writing is life before theory, experience before theory. You do not need a philosophical theory in order to be a good moral agent. What you need is a sense of the world and of what's important in experience. And that's not something that a theory can ever give you. So I think it's bad when ethics is diverted by the theory first claim. I think it's even worse, actually, when transgender people are sucked in by the theory first claim. You have no right to be transgender unless first you can explain it. Well, for God's sake, a lot of people, me included, work out that they're transgender at the age of 4 or 5. How the hell are they supposed to have a theory of transgender? It's a deeply unfair and cruel demand. I'll stop going on about it.
I did want to ask
point.
you if we I did want to ask you actually about the theory thing, that in particular, that there seems something right to me about, definitely about the idea that, well, you could have these experiences and they're as yet untheorized by you. But like, there's a way in which the theory is what allows you to understand them, right? Even to say I'm transgender is a theory, right? I mean,
Okay.
at some level of like,
Yeah.
And so there's like, it's also the case that somehow the building of the theory is part of what it is to be welcoming, to kind of allow people a self-understanding. Like, I sort of feel like there just must have been a lot of, not all, okay, some people are super independent and just really good at thinking for themselves, and I'm not one of those people. So I'm very sympathetic to all the people in history who just never knew they were gay or transgender, never knew it, right? Not even to themselves. Like, something was off, something was wrong. And they would group things with that didn't go with it because they didn't know how to collect it, right? And so in that way, I'm like, well, theory is super important for in some way even grasping the experience.
Well, yes. To some extent, this is a semantic question. There's different ways we might use the word theory. So, I mean, the paradigm of what I'm against is sort of Mr. Gradgrind utilitarianism. It's thinking that you should first formulate a theory of how the world is and what's valuable, and develop a kind of slide rule approach to practical reasoning, and then impose it on all your practical reasoning and say anything that doesn't fit with the slide rule approach is wrong by definition, because here's the theory. But you might use theory in a broader sense just to mean the upshot of any serious thought about things. And in that sense, how could I be against theory? In that sense, I'm clearly not against theory, because I'm very much in favor of thinking seriously about things and trying to work them out. But I don't think neat philosophical theory is always what comes out at the end of that. And I also, I think, particularly with the case of transgender, I think that it is very important to be experience first there, because experience in the end is all we have to go on. And if we have an ideology in our society that says people like me simply cannot exist, it's a corollary of our theory that there can't be people like you, which is what some Christian churches are still saying to transgender people right now. It's a corollary of our theory that there can't be people like you, to which, the obvious retort is, well, yeah, and here I am, so your theory is wrong, isn't it? But then the answer to that seems to be, but you're a sinner. You're an evil person, and that's why you think there's this delusion that you're caught in, and all that kind of stuff goes on. And so the ideology defends itself by circling the wagons and excluding the counterexample. I think healthy philosophy, healthy thought in general, has to start with our experience, has to start with how we find things in the world, and has to be honest about that. So in that sense, I'm a kind of 1930s, E.M. Forster kind of experience first kind of person. I think we've got to start with what we experience and where we are. We've got to start with perception. Actually, we've got to start with perception.
Tyler, are you able
Hi,
to talk?
you can hear
You're
me?
back.
Hey,
Yes,
all
we can
right,
hear you.
okay.
Okay, why don't you go ahead and ask the final question?
Yes, good. Final question. So, should we one day want to live in a society beyond or without gender? That is, should we aim at a society where people can freely compose their identities without the burden of having to announce their gender, or fit into a traditional binary?
I think my answer to that is I don't know, and I'd love to find out. I think that it's quite possible that we would move in that direction. I'm not sure. Without gender, yes. Without the sexual dimorphism, the biological dimorphism, I can't see how that would happen. I mean, we would need to go to something like the scenario in The Left-Handed Darkness, where people are actually biologically different. So then how dependent is the gender binary on the biological binary? I simply don't know. And what would happen if you changed it? Well, let's try it and see, I'm tempted to say. Can I just say, I see the poll, I see there were two polls that Tyler was running, and I was very interested by both of them. Both of them received relatively low numbers of votes, given there are 367 people in the room. But one was the pushing a button poll, which, if you could push a button, would you? 42 yes, 6 no. And I'll add myself to that. Yes, I would. And the other question, I think this is something that I really ought to pick up before we close. Should we be having philosophical debates about gender and trans people when there are trans people whose basic right to exist is under coordinated attack? And there's 37 yeses and 4 noes there. Well, I'll record myself as a yes. We should. Certainly we should. It's actually more important now than ever that we discuss these things, because there are a lot of people out there who simply don't get it. And it's not their fault. They just haven't come across it. They haven't come across transgender people. And like I say, that's not their fault. That's just the way they are. And there is a job of communication to be engaged with. And I said a moment ago that transgender people do not owe the world an explanation before they get on with living their lives. And that's true. But at the same time, we have to try and make things easier for people, because a lot of people find it hard to understand. So yes, we should debate these issues, but we shouldn't debate them in a certain way. There are ways of debating them, and this is a great way of debating them. I'm really enjoying this. This is wonderful. But being locked in a cage fight with someone who's viscerally hostile and has already decided the issue against transgender people's right to exist, then no, that's not on. I won't do that. I actually refuse that kind of debate myself. I won't engage in that. So what's not up for grabs is the question, do transgender people have a right to exist? That's absolutely not up for grabs, and I won't debate that. But what is up for grabs is, what does it mean to be transgender? What is gender here? What is trans here? What is sex here? That's all up for grabs, and I think we've had a bit of a go at thrashing some of it out here, and it's been fine.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sophie-Grace, for coming and talking to us. And thanks for all the students and other people who asked questions, and to Tyler and William, my Night Owls co-conspirators. And our next session is a week from this Wednesday. We're going to be talking about Black intellectuals and the literary canon with Hollis Robbins. It should be fun. So that's going to be at our usual time, on Wednesday evening. Okay, bye everyone.
Thanks very much, Agnes. And thank you to everybody who's listened and for the questions. And thank you, Tyler, for making it work. It's been great.